Ron Brady. Unfortunately, he died suddenly. He was a philosopher, and he was very much involved with the philosophy of Goethe and science. He was a sort of phenomenologist in America. He was really quite tremendous. He had a tremendous mind, and he sort of lived what he did. There's a very, very good paper of his in a book called it's edited by Seaman and Science. Brain's just gone. I've even got my own paper in it. Hold this one, stuff at the back. Seaman and Science editors. Book on Goethe. Could be called Goethe's Way of Science, I suppose, on the phenomenology of nature. SUNY, State University of New York Press, published it. There was a very good paper in there by Brady on rereading Goethe's Organics, or something like that. And it's on Goethe and the plant, sort of thing. But he develops the phenomenology first. And there's a few pages in there on the phenomenology of perception, which are absolutely brilliant. Now these are not taken from there. They're taken from an earlier paper, which is now unavailable in a book published by the University of Chicago Press. I can't remember what the name of the book was. I've used it for years. It's just gone. Unfortunately, it's never going to be republished. And the second paper I called Rereading Goethe's Organics is a second approach to the same problem that he dealt with in the first paper, which is the first paper was utterly exceptional. Yeah, it's from a paper called Form, you don't need to write this down, Form and Cause in Goethe's Morphology. It's in Amrine, Zucker and Wheeler, Goethe and the Sciences of Reappraisal. But apparently that's not going to be republished, which is a great pity. That paper was terrific. There were two good papers in there. And Brady was very, very good. I don't know if you're ever in New York, you should go to the Museum of Natural History. There's many reasons for going. They've now redone their dioramas of the organisms in habitats, and they're utterly marvellous. But you go to the top floor. Does anyone know it? You do? And that's where all the dinosaurs are. And the dinosaurs are laid out in a special way. It's done what's called cladistically. It's a different way of doing taxonomy. And when cladistics was first introduced, I remember it. There was a huge controversy about it. And people said it was anti-evolutionary, it was all sorts of things. When I say anti-evolutionary, it's nothing to do with creationism or any nonsense like that. It was done by biologists. And Brady, anyway, the exhibits, the whole of the top floor of the dinosaurs is laid out cladistically. And what are called the cladograms are on the floor. And you walk through it. You walk through, do they call them cladograms or is it clades? Can't remember. Cladograms are on the floor, and you walk through the cladistic classification, therefore, in walking through the museum if you go around the right way. And now, it turns out that Brady was the person who was instrumental in getting that done. Although he didn't work there, he was on some kind of board or something or other, and he marshaled things together and insisted that when they redid the dinosaurs, they did it in this modern way. It's a tremendous exhibition, and also it's the only place where I've ever heard Meryl Streep's own voice. The first time I went there, there was, in the chamber when you go, there was a film going on, and there was this voice narrating. And I thought, a woman's voice, and I thought, God, that voice is lovely. I could sit here and just listen to this all day. It's beautiful. And I got quite carried away. So I went to someone, and I said, who is this woman? He said, that's Meryl Streep. And I said, my God, of course, I've never heard Meryl Streep's voice. Because every film she's in, she puts on a different voice. Well, she had then anyway. And so I'd never heard her voice before. She's got a lovely voice. So there we are. I'm in love with Meryl Streep's voice. Now you know. That's it. 2 reasons for going to the dinosaur. Only 1 for you, 2 for me. Anyway, in this paper, I've just taken those out of the paragraph which I quote here, and he is here describing the dynamic form of life as becoming other in order to remain itself. Is that a quote from me or a quote from him? Do you know, I don't know where I am this afternoon. Is that me or is it him? What's it say here? Describes that. No, I don't know what I'm doing here. That's me, not him. No, what was my French word? Or, yes, that's right. No, the second 2 are. That's it. He talks about. I'll read it then. The forms of life are not finished work, but always forms becoming, and their potency to be otherwise, in quotes, is an immediate aspect of their internal constitution. The becoming that belongs to this constitution is not a process that finishes when it reaches a certain goal, but a condition of existence, a necessity to change in order to remain the same. Now that's a very remarkable thing, because this is, as it were, it is a phenomenological description of life itself. This is the phenomenon of life. Life is that which must change in order to remain the same. Otherwise it dies. And therefore it is intrinsic to life, to what is living, that it has a potency. Now potency means power. It doesn't mean potentiality in the way we usually think of this. It means power. It does mean potentiality, but actually it's a bit weak. And also then people start thinking something else. Potency is power, the power to be otherwise. That is living. And it must have that because it must change in order to remain the same. It's the only way life can be, to remain living, is to change. And in changing, it must remain the same. So it's potency to be otherwise, is a potency to be otherwise in order to remain the same. So it is becoming other in order to remain itself. Top line's me. I forgot. I'm so muddled up this afternoon. I thought I was quoting Brady and it's me. Never mind.
Can you explain the same in itself to me? Because I don't quite understand that in order to remain the same. I understand becoming other in order to remain itself.
Yes.
But I don't understand in order to remain the same.
Well, it's language, this one. This is just language. You have to get the sense of it. I mean, I wouldn't put it that way myself. I would have put the word itself there. But Ron didn't he put that. What he meant by that is what I put by itself. Sometimes with language you just have to sort of read between the lines a bit. You know. And it's very, very, I mean, that's a very interesting idea, is this necessity to change. This is what Goethe encountered. This is what Goethe came to. And Brady was able to bring this out, and it's come out in other ways and stuff I've done. Now Darwin, funnily enough, came to the same thing in his work on barnacles and otherwise. Darwin was a very, very remarkable man. I don't want to really quote, but I can't find it. He said, I'd put something in here somewhere, I don't know where it is. Where are you, Darwin, for heaven's sake? Darwin was deeply impressed, overwhelmed even, by the ubiquity of variation. Before he did his work with barnacles, Darwin had believed that variation is the exception in nature. He believed there was variation, but it was exceptional, occurring only in times of crisis. This is why they say Darwin wrote up his book and then shoved it in a drawer in 1842 and didn't bring it out again until 1859 when Wallace was on the horizon with the same idea. It's not true. What he actually wrote in 1842 was quite different from what he published in 1859. In 1842, he thought variation only happened under crisis. By 1959, he realised that variation was the very quality of life itself, and therefore it was everywhere, it was ubiquitous. Darwin believed that variation is exception in nature, occurring only. His barnacle work changed that. Here he found that there are no unvarying forms, and that barnacle species are, as he put it, eminently variable. What made the work of classification so difficult was that, quote, every part of every species was prone to change. The closer he looked, the more stability seems to be an illusion. Barnacles, he told Hooker, are infinitely variable, and in the context of his theory of what he called the transmutation of species, he never talked about evolution, he called it the transmutation of species. He went further to see variations as incipient species. That's how he got it. It was a switching gestalt, like the reversing cube. In one perspective, the phenomenon appears as the variations of the species. In the other perspective, the phenomenon, this very same phenomenon, appears as the initial stages of new species. So this is how he saw it. And that's how he came to it. And then, of course, he saw it in... 23. No, come on, get in the right place. He saw it in pigeons, rabbits, everything, absolutely everything. So when he did the 1859 book, it was based on this, that life was variation, life was change, is change, cannot not be changed. Whereas previously he thought it only changed when there was a crisis in the environment. But of course what he did was he worked with Goethe. I mean, Darwin was a tremendously great naturalist. I mean, what Goethe saw, when Goethe saw this, he saw that this is the very quality of life itself. But when Darwin saw this, he wanted to find an explanation. There's a big difference here. He wanted an explanation, so he wanted a theory as to how this could happen. For Goethe, there's no question about an explanation or a theory because none is needed, like Wittgenstein. You just see it. When you really see it, you realise you are seeing the phenomenon. It is you come up against the phenomenon. This is life. Life is a phenomenon. Now, we're not used to this. We're all being ruined by our education. The intellectual mind demands an explanation for everything, a reason for everything, and so on. So when you say you reach this phenomenon and that's it, that's where it stops, people think, come on, he's pulling the wool over our eyes, that's rubbish. There has to be an explanation. If you want an explanation, you turn the phenomenon into something else. When you explain it, you explain it in terms of something else. So it's no longer that phenomenon, but it's really something else which isn't that phenomenon, which is producing it. It's very hard for us to get this experience where you stand face to face with the phenomenon and it hits you and you realise that what you're seeing is the real. What Goethe encountered with this, and Darwin too, but he then went sideways, is life itself, is livingness. And Goethe talks about this. He says, we're always wanting to go on past the thing. But there comes a point where when you reach it, it stops. And the greatest temptation is to go on and everything's ruined. And that's what Wittgenstein picked up on. That there's a point where you stop, you've reached it. And of course the intellectual mind just won't have it. Which is why Wittgenstein was so opposed in the end to all forms of explanation and generalization, and said, no, seeing is the thing. That's phenomenological seeing. Now this will not convince you, it's not my aim to convince you, but it's just to point out that for these people who do this kind of work, they come into this encounter, as it were, as if you mean, and the shock is, my God, this is life. Life is a phenomenon. Now, we don't think life's a phenomenon. We've no feeling for life whatsoever. We actually think it's something that's produced by something else. So a lot of chemicals come together, or some spirit comes down, or whatever. We have no adequate way of thinking about life. We turn life into a kind of souped up matter, or a kind of toned down spirit. So we approach it either way. But actually what we're looking at is a third thing which is neither. It is life. Life itself. And we just have not got this idea. And that's also why Goethe is so important. Because he does have this idea. Because he's seen it. And so Brady tried to capture this. Although, as he would be the first to say, this will convince no one who's not tried it for themselves. Fair enough. Anyway, that I think is terrific. A necessity to change in order to remain the same. So it becomes different in order to remain itself. Yes. I mean, Goethe does have some. Goethe does have some quotes like this. I guess if I can show this. Oh God! Thank you. Oh. Oh, never mind. Perhaps I won't bother.
Well, there's another switch on the plug. No?
Oh, thank you.
Ah,
It's only
magic touch.
I just wanted to do this for a bit of fun, really. It's not necessary. This is Goethe. Oh. All is new, yet the old ever recurs. She is complete, yet ever unfinished. He had this marvellous way of writing these sentences. It was the second part of the sentence contradicted the first part of the sentence. And it's deliberate, because it pushes you onto the tightrope, where you have to see both those simultaneously. All is new, yet the old ever recurs. That's his description of life. She is complete, yet ever unfinished. It's a description of nature, it could be a description of life. But however, what we've just been talking about, I personally think the best statement ever was made by Calvin Klein. She is always and never the same. And I think that's life. And I think that's also a perfect description of it. Life is always and never the same. And that's also a perfect description of the archetype. Always and never the same, to come to later. Which proves, in case you didn't know it, that the archetype is feminine. Right? This is a joke. Wasn't worth getting out for, wasn't it?
Sorry. I think it's interesting how that did an advertisement for a perfume called Contradiction.
Yes. Yeah. Well, life, you see, is contradiction. That's why people couldn't see how to think it. Because if you think in terms of a logic of solids, then you've got to do either or. And it's not either or. That's the thing, it's both. And the boths are opposites. And then it starts with Hegel, this beginning. You've got to learn to think in this new kind of way. Hegel, at the same time that Goethe was doing this, was developing a new kind of logic, which you have to think the opposites simultaneously. It degenerated into other things. But originally, this is what he was trying to do. So actually, what really happened was that Hegel was an organic thinker. He was trying to think in logic, in the way in which Goethe saw in life. Same kind of thing. Oh, well, anyway, never mind.
So you can be epistemological and phenomenological both, kind of. That you can use logic and reason at the same time as being encountering the phenomena.
Yes, you can. But what you do is you use them. You can. But you're going to use the reason in a form which will not fit the standard logical pattern. Which is not so much of a problem as people think. You see, people don't actually know where logic comes from. People have no idea how logic originated. If you know how logic originated, you wouldn't feel so much bound by it. It actually comes from mathematics. And it was developed by Aristotle, who said that he spent years and years observing the thinking of the mathematicians. So for him, the thinking of the mathematicians was the phenomenon. And he described this. Now, what were the mathematicians doing, and who were they? These were the Greek mathematicians, more to the point, Athenian mathematicians, at the time when there was an astonishing creative renaissance and surge forward of mathematics in 5th century, 4th century Athens, whatever it was. And the Platonic Academy, obviously Plato's Academy, was one of the centres where mathematics was highly developed. And Aristotle was there for 18 years. And what he did was he saw the way in which the speciality of the Greek mathematicians of that period is that they invented the method of proof, which I alluded to the other day, where you must show, say for example, that the internal angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, two right angles, without drawing any triangles at all. It's not empirical. It comes from the idea. This is a Greek invention, Greek discovery. This is the great discovery in mathematics of the Greeks in the Platonic Academy. And Plato had a big hand in this. Which is why so much of Plato's philosophy alludes to mathematics as an example, as an intermediate case. And indeed, a lot of his philosophy can actually be seen to be much more tied to mathematics, mathematical thinking, than people realise. Because he doesn't have any mathematics in it. But it's actually mathematical thinking which gives it the form. So what Aristotle did was he observed the thinking of the mathematicians when they were engaged in this process of proof. Very often one way of proving something, for example, that the number of prime numbers is infinite. What you do is you say the opposite. You say, let's suppose that the number of prime numbers is finite. You then work out the consequences of that and find you're led into a contradiction. Therefore, the original premise was wrong. And therefore, the opposite of that is right. So, if the premise that what was the first thing I said?
No, the prime numbers.
Yes, if the premise that the prime numbers are not infinite is wrong, then the premise that the prime numbers is infinite must be right, and that's how you do it. And this is how they did it. This is it. And that's where, in there, you've already got Aristotle's principle of non-contradiction. Either A or not A. You've got the principle of the excluded middle. It's either A or not A. There's no third possibility. And the first one is the principle of identity, which is another thing. You can't have the principle of non-contradiction without having the principle of identity. So the three principles which he brilliantly, masterfully identified are there in the thinking of mathematicians, but these are Greek Athenian mathematicians. And what then happened was that logic was generalized to become, so this is universal. All thinking must actually conform to this. Well, it turns out that not even mathematical thinking conforms to that. The Chinese didn't think that way. And of course, one way of getting around this, and this is what people did, say, well, Chinese mathematics was rubbish. It doesn't count. What really counts is Western mathematics based on the Greek method. Right? The Arabs didn't think that. Well, rubbish. They're no good. What really matters is, and this is what people have done, they've turned this Greek method into something universal, dogmatized it. And in fact, even in mathematics it doesn't hold. But outside of mathematics, there's no reason for it to hold whatsoever. And this is what people have realized. But the claim that things should be logical puts it into this form. And it actually comes from this quite restricted background. So, as someone said, this is Maurice Klein, in his book, the name of which I cannot remember, Mathematics, the Loss of Certainty. Logic is the child of mathematics. And that's where it came from. And most of Plato's philosophy is the child of mathematics as well. And if people realize this, they wouldn't absolutize it so much. So when Hegel comes along and says, well, actually, in effect for life, you can't have this principle of contradiction because the opposites are somehow the both true at the same time, people went berserk and said, and they still to this day say that man was a total idiot. But in fact, he wasn't a total idiot. He latched onto something very strongly. And we're not through this yet. But I've got a lot in the book about what I've just been talking about. Several places where I go into the foundations of logic and mathematics. Because we need to know this. Because it actually changes things. And you can then begin to see how so many things just don't fit that logic. But then we force them to do so and say it must be like this. So life doesn't fit this logic. And so then we say you're not thinking straight or whatever it is and so on and that, but it's not true. It's again of finding that extra freedom. Anyway, there we are. I'm going to talk about varieties. I am. Well, so far it's a bit boring. We've only considered the organs of the plant. We've got to expand our horizons a bit. It's time to take in something a bit wider, because you can look at the different varieties of plant species in the same way, always becoming other in order to remain itself. Now, Goethe, and everybody knows this, that in fact, if you look at what you would call the same plant in growing under different circumstances, the same species of plant growing under different circumstances, it will come out differently. And sometimes the differences can be quite dramatic. I mean, Goethe, when he crossed the Alps, was very surprised to see the kind of plants there which he could recognize as the same as the plants that he knew in South Germany, but they looked considerably different, often greatly shortened because of the cold and so on and that. But he didn't see many different plants. What he saw was all these varieties, these variations, he saw as the self-differences of one plant. It's one plant being itself differently according to the circumstances. So that's how the varieties can be seen. And you have to do this in a way that's really rather careful, because otherwise you can easily fall into an inorganic kind of thinking here. What we tend to do is we say, well, the plant in its environment will be influenced by that environment, correct? But then we think of that environment acting on that plant in an external, mechanical kind of way, as if it were an inorganic object, which is passively being influenced by the environment, moulded by the environment in a certain way. We might, something like that, very often people do think that way, and especially otherwise. They do this with people. This is, always been the big objection that people have had, to say, when you say that, well, we exist within a society and culture and this influences us. People object to this because they say that means you're saying that the society and the culture mould the individual person so there's no individuality. Well, it doesn't mean that at all, and it doesn't mean that with the plant. Goethe was very clear that the plant had its own active nature. and that what happened in a particular environment, it responded to that environment in accordance with its own nature, not just passively moulded by it, but it actively responded from out of itself to that environment, producing, as it's possible to do because of its potency to be otherwise, of the form of itself which is fitting for that environment. And in that sense you can say the environment elicits from the plant that form. You cannot say the environment causes that form, because it is the plant itself which responds. You could say that there's a challenge and response here. The environment is a challenge to the plant, and the plant responds, but it's the plant which responds. It is not simply moulded passively by the environment, because it is a living organism, and living organisms have their own potency to be otherwise, the ability to change in order to remain itself, and that's how they are. It's not like something in physics, a body in physics, responding to an external law. It's not like that at all. But we often think of the plant in that kind of way. We often think of people in society in that kind of way. And that's all the objections that there are to this kind of thinking that so many people quickly come up with. So the specific form which it takes is in fact not the result of external conditions acting directly on the plant. They influence the plant, but they don't cause it, because the organism has its own contribution to make. And Goethe spoke of the particular individual plant form as being a conversation between the living organism and the environment. And that at least draws our attention to the plant's active contribution. Steiner had a statement about this which I like. We must conceive at a deeper level than the influences of external conditions something which does not passively allow itself to be determined by these conditions, but actively determines itself under their influence. So that is its response to the challenge that makes to it. It actively determines itself out of its potency to be otherwise. So the living organism configures itself actively instead of being conditioned passively. Now, Craig Hodridge describes this very well. Now, Craig's book is Craig's book. The problem with Craig's book is it's got two titles and subtitles. It's in the same series as my book, and his book was published first and then mine. And it was published in America, and Flores Books here also published it here. In the case of my book, Flores Books insisted on changing the subtitle and put a different cover on it. So in America, where it came from, my book is a different subtitle. That's not too bad. With Craig's book, Flores Books insisted on changing the title and the subtitle. So on two continents, his book has got two entirely different, and he really was annoyed by that. And he told me he'd never let that happen again. Anyway, in America, his book is called Genetics and the Manipulation of Life. Subtitle, The Forgotten Factor of Context. I don't know what the English title is. The one here will be the English title. I know he liked the American title, that was his title. See, the publisher here, the publisher, he thinks he knows better. Publishers always think they know better. They don't. Anyway, there we are. It's in the library, if it hasn't been pinched. And it's a very, very, very good book. Yeah?
The idea that the organism determines itself in the environment, it seems like it's kind of like programmed. What is it?
Programmed? Where'd you get programs from?
Just that it determines itself?
Yes.
That something is being elicited from it?
No, it's actually actively producing itself in this form. It has the possibility to take that form, but that possibility is not preformed. If it was programmed, it would be preformed. See, that's the other problem. This is a tightrope again. Fall off the tightrope on one side, and what you get is a picture that says the environment causes it to take this form. Fall off on the other side, and you say, oh, it's pre-programmed. These forms are programmed. Now, this is in this quote of Craig's. The very point you've made is here. Imagine that you are holding a groundsel seed in your hands before planting it. Depending on how, when and where you plant the seed, a limitless variety of forms can arise. All these potential forms are not, of course, stored in the seed. The concrete forms are emergent characteristics that arise out of a germinal state and develop in the interplay between the plant's plasticity and the environmental conditions. In particular surroundings, the potential of the plant is evoked, but what appears is only one manifestation of the myriad ways in which this plant could develop. Now, the specific form of an individual plant is neither determined by the environment nor predetermined by the organism itself. As Craig Holridge indicates, we must avoid thinking in a finished product manner as if the potential forms were already there in the plant like peas in a pod. And that when the environment is such, oh, okay, out comes this form. You got the idea? But it's not like that. It's not preformed. This is dynamic. When we do that, when we fall off the tightrope onto either determined by the environment or preformed in the organism, we go into mechanical thinking. Only on the tightrope are we thinking organically, dynamically. And it's hard. And now the great thing is this. It's very important to fall off the tightrope on both sides. Because then we can see the two sides, the opposites through which we've got to find the third way, which is neither. And so these are very helpful to have these two. I'll forget one. Oh, God. There's a name Aristotle uses in the Ethics. It's so good. One's the error of excess. What's the opposite of excess?
What?
Deficit. Is that what that do? One's the error of excess and the other is the error of deficit. Oh, forget it. You've got to get the picture. In fact, if you imagine that the possibilities are already preformed in the organism and they just pop out in the circumstances, then once again, isn't that milk to cheese thinking? No, cheese to milk thinking.
Could it be though that inside of the seed is the potential for all potentials? They're not programmed.
That's right. They're not.
But the seed has the potential of all the myriad ways that it could grow. So it is there, but it's not there.
Well, that's right. It is there, but it's not there, and that's what's meant by potency. It's highly dynamic, and this is the great problem. Always making sure that you really are thinking dynamically. When you do this work, you keep discovering, I'm not thinking dynamically. You thought you were, and you're not. So you've got to keep pushing yourself to try to go further and further. And what you're actually doing each time is you're trying to push yourself to go further and further upstream. Because when you don't think dynamically, you're actually downstream. And it is very difficult. Later today, if I still exist, what time is it? Or perhaps tomorrow morning. Yeah, I think tomorrow morning. I'll do a brief quote from a major book at the present time, where the author, who spent years and years and years and years and years with Goethe, simply hasn't got it. It's quite surprising. It's not a criticism. It's very difficult to get the dynamic aspect. And I'm going to also tomorrow ask this question. Why is it that why is it that people don't come to think in Goethe's way? Even people who write books on Goethe and spend years and years on Goethe, they still don't come to think in this dynamical way. Why is that? Because that's what happens. How can that be? So many terrifically clever people who've gone into all these things still do not think dynamically. And I'm going to say something about that tomorrow morning. I think tomorrow morning, well, it won't be later tomorrow morning, will it? It could be later, I don't know. Because it enables me thereby to reflect on, that will be tomorrow morning, what Goethe was doing, and it will hopefully lead forward into what Margaret's going to do with you. Because what Margaret's going to do is actually work with Goethe's way of doing things. I'm not doing that. I'm doing the philosophy of Goethe's way of seeing. I'm not working with Goethe's way of seeing directly. If I were, I wouldn't be sitting here talking like this. We'll be doing different kinds of things and you'll be doing different kinds of mental activities. You're going to do those with Margaret next week. The hope is that when you get what I've done and what she does together, the penny will drop. It'll click, right? Pennies don't drop anymore, do they? They click. It'll click. Yes, it'll click. That's the hope. Well, just to finish this bit, I think it's quite... I've talked a bit about this, this environmental variety. I've got a quote. I really missed this quote out, didn't I? Where shall I put it in? Oh, I'll put it in at the end. I want you to take one further step now, because we've looked briefly at the variety which results from differences in environmental factors. But there's a much greater variety, as you all know, which actually arises from genetic variation. And this is within a species, and this is what interests the breeder, is it not? Yes, it is. The breeder, do you know the people who breed things? Yeah. He or she is always on the lookout for interesting variations which can then be propagated. And that's the process of artificial selection, which Darwin took as his model for natural selection. And that's how the huge variety in any one species of plants arise. You wouldn't get it just from the phenotypic variation we've been talking about. Now, for example, many examples, but the example I'm going to use, one day my wife was watching the Chelsea Flower Show on television. The Chelsea Flower Show is a flower show that happens at Chelsea. Once a year. It's a very posh do. You can't go in.
The annual Chelsea Flower Show.
You can't go in. A lot of people go, but you've got to be really big in the gardening world to get a ticket. Anyway, but they have it on television every night. And she was watching this, and I was pretending to take no notice. This is what you do. And suddenly they're talking about this, and they say, well, this was the day when they showed the peonies. And this person said, well, there are 1,000 varieties of peonies. It is just such a prolific plant. There's about 1,000 varieties, and they're all here. Well, at this point, of course, I suddenly said to her, God, this is interesting, isn't it? Because the idea of 1,000 varieties of peonies is actually quite marvellous, because they're all there. There they are, all in the Chelsea Flower Show, all on one day. So what you've got before you as extensively many different plants is organically one plant being itself multiply. And now you really have got self-differencing, because these are peonies, but they're all very different because they're actually different species. So what you see as extensively many plants is intensively multiple, one plant only. And that's the fantastic expression of self-differencing. It's amazing. And that means that the diversity of the peonies that we see is the living unity of the peony. It's in front of our eyes. we don't see it. What we see is the diversity, and don't realise we're looking straight at the unity, because that diversity is the unity. Now this is astonishing. It really is. Just imagine looking at all those peonies and asking yourself what they all have in common. I know, let's try and find a common peony. Just how bizarre that would be when you compare it to the living way of looking, where it is always becoming other in order to remain itself, self-differencing itself. So what this means is, we have to learn to recognize diversity as the dynamic unity of life. The diversity is the unity. The unity is the diversity. There's no separation. And I've now reached one of the major stopping points in your syllabus. You've still got your, I haven't brought it with me, you've seen your syllabus and what you're doing this year. I've got a copy in file at home. And one of the things, important things which is stressed, this year the student will learn to recognize diversity as creative unity. Right, you're there. You can tick that off. You tick box, tick that off. We've done that. We've done that. So you see, this has been a very fruitful week. You're on your way already. Right? To get this is extraordinary. And you see, people today acknowledge diversity. Everybody acknowledges diversity. But how many people see that diversity is unity? Not nearly so many. It just doesn't occur to us, because we haven't got the pathway of thinking to lead us to that. And that's what we come to do here. We recognise that diversity is the unity. It's quite astonishing. I'll come to you in a minute. This is not what we would expect to find. No one would expect to find this, because the unity is hidden, in quotes, hidden right in front of our eyes as diversity. It's quite astonishing. I've got a quote now, one quote, and then, well, I'll come to you then. I have a quote, God knows where it is. Oh, come on. Another quote from Deleuze. Now, I did want to give this quote. Here we are. This is from Deleuze. And Deleuze is talking about entirely different things. He's not working with this kind of thing at all. Multiplicity is the inseparable manifestation, essential transformation, and constant symptom of unity. I'll read that again. Multiplicity is the inseparable manifestation. You can't separate the multiplicity out. The inseparable manifestation, essential transformation, and constant symptom of unity. You can't separate the multiplicity from the unity, because it is that. Multiplicity is the affirmation of unity. Becoming is the affirmation of being. Now he's come to this from an entirely different route, nothing to do with all this. As you can see there, that's saying what we've been doing. It's no wonder people interested in Deleuze find Goethe interesting. So I find this quite astonishing. Now you had a question.
Yeah. Trying to get you can go. Well, I guess my question is just that, for me, I've always thought of...
I can't hear. Can you speak clearly?
The unity in diversity and the diversity in the unity, I've never thought about it this way, from upstream. And it's always been enough for me to think of interdependence between parts.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to know what you thought about that as an approach to seeing the unity.
Well, the interdependence among parts is there, isn't it? Because these are all internally related. So the interdependence among parts is there. But now, from this point of view, we can see how that arises. It's the same as the whole coming to presence in the part. It's the same thing, only I've gone to this language of unity and diversity, multiplicity and so on, rather than the language of the whole and the part. If the whole comes to presence through the if the whole comes to presence through the parts, then each part is a reflection of the whole. Therefore, the parts must be internally related. Well, it's the same here. It's exactly the same thing. It's isomorphic, to use a posh word from mathematics. It's the same form, just change the language. If the diversity is the unity, because the diversity is actually the self-differences, then the diversity, all that must be internally related. Can you see that now?
Yes.
I'm glad you can see that. Perhaps you can explain it to me. As I was saying that, I felt my mind just go whoop. And I thought, I'm not going to get into this.
I mean, did you really mean that? Because I get the diversity and the self-differences. That really, I mean, if you really meant to say that.
Yes, I did mean to say that. It's all right. I did mean to say that. Yes, I did mean to say that. And it is true. You can go from this language to the whole and part language. And then you can go back to the one and many, unity and diversity language. You can go from whole and part to unity. Oh, God. See, the trouble is my brain's got so tired it won't operate the organs of speech properly. You can go from the language of whole and part to the language of unity and diversity, and backwards and forwards between them. Now, obviously, I don't do that. I'm finding it hard enough doing what I do. So if I started doing that, we find it too difficult. But once you've absorbed it, then you can do that. And you can switch and you can use whichever language you like. Now, it's true that originally I did whole and part, and with all this, I do unity and diversity, because that's the language that they were using. And it allows me to say, look, there's an entirely new idea of the one and many here. You see, the idea of the one and the many is one of the key ideas in Greek philosophy, which has come all the way through. And what this says is, yes, and what's more, there's an entirely different idea of the one and many. So there's actually a lot in here which is much more powerful still than you might realise by doing it in this way. But I do take your point about the whole and the part, and I like that you can switch from the one to the other, and I think it's a valuable thing to do. Flexibility. Yes.
I'm not too sure if I'm confusing this way of thinking with purely being the what happens, or if does this way of thinking also include the how and the why of what happens? Is that a stupid question?
No. Oh no. When I said it's a crap question, I wasn't. Yeah, I realised I shouldn't have said that. I meant these intellectuals in universities who ask crap questions like, what would Goethe say about the Big Bang? I meant that kind of thing. No one here said anything like that, have they? No. And if they do have something like that now, they certainly won't say it now, will they? This is my self-protection. No, this is a very important question. That is it just a what? You see, it's very difficult to answer this question because it depends what satisfies people. Today we demand a mechanical explanation, a causal explanation for everything. But our idea, this is only since the 17th century, our idea of causality is a very one-dimensional thing. It's mechanical causality. It's external. It's what's in before that, there was a much richer idea of causality, which we look upon as being missing the point. In Aristotle, you have the formal and the final cause. You have the material cause and the operational cause. What's it called, the operational cause? Come on, you Aristotelians. What's the name of the operational cause? Effective cause, something like that. Yes. Now, we've reduced it to, we've taken the material and the effective and just turned it into mechanical causality. Now, if you go back to the early days of physics, early mathematical physics in the Middle Ages and so on, when people had found the mathematical law, according to which something happened, they saw that as the cause. Now, we don't. we say, oh no, it's not a cause, that wouldn't tell you how that happens. There's got to be a force pushing it somehow. And that came later. But for the guys who originally did it, once you'd found, Kepler particularly, once you'd found that mathematical relationship, that was the cause of the phenomenon. Because that was the formal cause, and that was the thought of God. And so, what you mean by cause changes with different periods in history. We now demand a mechanical explanation, and say only when we have an external thing can we do that. Now, there's a lot to be said for that too, but I think there is this other dimension that when you actually see what something is, then you understand something about it, which leaves you at that level not feeling satisfied that you don't need any more. Other things will come along, and there's other things to do. I don't know if I've made that. It's not convincing, is it?
Not yet.
No.
Maybe it will. When I'm further down the line.
Well, see what happens after you've been with Margaret. You can obviously take this further, and it does go further. In a way, for what I want to do, for what I use this for, I've actually done enough now. Now I've got this idea of unity and diversity, and this dynamic idea. For me, I've got enough. But of course, there's an awful lot more to this. And it goes on a bit, because people then say, well, couldn't we look upon all the plants in the world as somehow the one plant? And that, of course, is what Goethe came to do, the whole plant kingdom as one plant. But it's a bit more complicated, and then it comes to the idea that this, the one plant in this case, when we're actually seeing the different plants, that we're seeing the dynamical self-differences of one plant, not one peony or one rose, but one plant. And that's all the plants that we see. And that has a name. This one organ has a name. And the name in German for the one organ... Thank you. The name in German for the one organ is Urpflanzer. No, that's not it. That's for the one plant. The name for the one organ is Urorgan. Now, this prefix UR is a grammatical feature of the German language. Many words in German begin with that prefix UR. And there comes a problem when you want to translate this into English. Because how are you going to do it? If you're German, it's such a feature of the German language, you'll be so used to it, you wouldn't worry about it. But when we translate it into English, what usually happens is it gets translated in one of two ways. Well, it will get translated as in the first either primordial or archetypal. So you have the primordial organ or the archetypal organ. Let's stick with the plant. The primordial plant or the archetypal plant. And both of these words are actually referring to the intrinsically dynamic unity of coming into being, which is the one plant being itself differently as multiplicity and unity across the board. But they both have disadvantages, because the term primordial plant makes you think of a primitive ancestor long ago from which all other plants have come procreationally. And that's not really what it means. And the adjective archetypal brings in a whole load of problems, because the word archetypal is associated with the philosophy of Platonism. Mm-hmm. Now, I came a cropper with this when I gave a talk at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, because I was banging on about archetypal, and I mean, what's his name was there? The Passion of the Western Mind. Totnes.
Yeah.
Totnes was there, and he knows all about this, because he's an expert on Plato. But because it was California, San Francisco, I didn't realise a lot of people in the audience thought I was talking about Carl Jung when I used the word archetype. Mm-hmm. Well, I should have thought of that, but I didn't. So, by archetype here, I mentioned what is meant is the way this is used before Jung was born, which is actually the Platonic use of the term. And that really brings in a lot of difficulty. Because there is what's called the standard established interpretation of Plato, according to which it is a two-world philosophy, and so it's strongly dualistic. And according to this view, Plato held the fundamental ontology of the world was on two different levels. There's a level of what we see around us, where we sort of are now, the world of changing appearances that we experience through the senses and so on. And that world is impermanent and always changing and moving about. And then there's an ontologically superior world, which is the level of the archetypes, which are called forms or ideas. The word form is Latin for idea, and people talk about Plato's theory of forms, Plato's theory of ideas, but form is just Latin for translation of the Greek word idea. Well, ideas with a capital I, the archetypes, which are eternally one and the same, and they constitute the original templates or models according to which everything that we know in the lower world is formed. And what we have are imperfect copies of the real thing. So everything here is an imperfect copy of the real thing in the higher world. And of course there's lots of problems about how the connection between these two and so on, is there participation, is there not, whatever it is, and so on and that. And the standard model, usually, these are not seen as just two different ontological levels, which are distinct, but they're separated. There's an abyss between them, which the Greek word is chorismos. There's a separation between them. So we have a very, very strongly dualistic ontology. And what is in the archetypal world, the world of the forms, is one. So there's one archetype for all the many that there are, copies that there are here. And what is in the lower world is clearly many. And because they're separated, the one is separated from the many, and this is referred to in the literature as the one over many, or the one over the many. The one is boss over the many. There's a separation. Well, you can see what we've just been doing. There's no separation at all because the one is the many. And there are many, many problems occur to this, with this, and so on and that, because what it amounts to so many things like thinking of a world outside the world, which nevertheless is modelled on this world, but is said to be perfect, and so on. And there are so many difficulties with this, which people have been discussing forever, that you wonder why Plato ever thought this way in the first place. And the answer may be that, well, he didn't. He didn't think this. What we think of as Plato's philosophy may really be a misrepresentation of Plato. And it's possible that he did not subscribe himself to this, it's called the two-world theory. He did not subscribe to that. And Gadamer, the great German philosopher who died at the age of 102 in 2002, who spent his life studying Plato, Aristotle, said in one famous seminar, Plato was no Platonist. And he referred to the standard established interpretation as pseudo-Platonism or vulgar Platonism. Vulgar in the sense of not rude, but of common. Plato, though, may have unwittingly encouraged this misunderstanding by the way he presented the ideas and their relation to the world of the senses, and he later went to considerable lengths to try to correct it. And, in fact, in the Parmenides. Now, one of the suggestions is that a separation was made, but the separation was methodological. And it's because Plato was very, very keen to get across this idea that when you were doing mathematics, because the Platonic Academy was an academy of mathematics, when you're doing mathematics, you must not proceed empirically. You must not refer to actual triangles. You must refer to the very idea of triangle. And you must be absolutely rigorous about this. You must make a separation between these two. Always the idea, never an actual triangle. You can see, and that separation, which is methodologically necessary for mathematics, and this was their great discovery. It's an astonishing discovery, and people today still don't understand this, what mathematics is. This astonishing discovery required him to emphasize a chorismos, a separation between the two. Because there's many cases where he's telling people off because they're working with triangles, and he said, what are you doing drawing triangles? What are you doing these measurements for? This isn't empirical, this is mathematical. He wanted to get across the very idea of the mathematical. So he had to make this separation. Well, then this all got caught up with his whole philosophy and ontology, and this separation got built in, not as a methodological one, but as an ontological one. We talked about this the other day. Here's another case where something that is appropriate methodologically is wrongly ontologized. And so as I said, there is a distinction between the appearances and the idea. We were doing that ourselves in the phenomenology. There is a distinction, but there's no separation. And therefore the whole thing may have been a misunderstanding. But it's a misunderstanding that has had absolutely devastating consequences. Because, I mean, we live with it right through to today. People still think in terms of a two-world theory. I've got something here. Just a minute. I'll just find this. Alfred North Whitehead, the great mathematician and philosopher, famously says that the Western philosophical tradition consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. There's a lot in that. It's obviously an exaggeration, but there's also in that. But the influence of Platonism extends far beyond philosophy. The impact it had on Western Christianity led Nietzsche to declare, and Heidegger agreed, that the doctrine of the church is Platonism for the people. This tremendous separation as you get between body and soul and so on in the church and so on and that. And in fact with Augustine and so on, you can see the way in which Christian doctrine changes and actually becomes Platonized all the way through, and it builds in this separation, which may well be the pseudo-Platonism. Interestingly, the Greek church, the Orthodox church, which realized there was this problem, and Western philosophers who deal with Plato never look at what they did with Plato and the Greek church, the Orthodox church, which actually was just as big as the Catholic church and the whole Eastern church. And they modified Plato, and they had a Platonic picture, but they reduced this separation and brought it out as participation. So that what you experience is much more like Goethe, because what you actually experience as the phenomenal appearance is the archetype itself, but in phenomenal mode, which of course is exactly what Goethe is doing. That when you see the plant, each plant is the archetypal plant, but in fact in a one-sided way, and because the one is the many, you can't separate them. I've said that very badly because I've forgotten about all that. But the Greek church actually had originally a very interesting, very different attitude here, which is much more holistic, much more participative, much more organic, and much closer to what Goethe was talking about and so on. And the Western Church really separated everything and became very, very analytical and very divisive in the way it saw everything. Anyway, that's another thing. There is also the influence that Platonism had on the transition to the heliocentric system of planetary astronomy. The reason why that switch was made was because in Platonism, there was a resurgence of Platonism, and the sun, it has a very special place. And in Christianized Neoplatonism, the sun became the representative of God. And the only place you can put the representative of God is in the center. And that's really why that was done. It was done for what we would now call religious or theological reasons. And so on. In fact, the Platonism is the historical source of the idea that there are laws of nature which are transcendent, which people still have today. They still talk about the laws of nature as if somehow they were outside of nature, imposed on nature, ordering nature. Physicists always talk about the mathematical laws as if they were transcendent, because they are, or were originally seen, as the thoughts of God, which are transcendent. As one modern philosopher said, metaphysics, that's Platonism, is alive and well and lives on in modern physics, which is the last place you think of looking for it. So, when we talk about the archetypal plant with Goethe, we have got really quite a problem, because all of this stuff gets brought in. And that's why I find the word archetypal plant very, very difficult. The other way to look at it is to say that if you actually take the Goethean point of view, that would transform our understanding of the archetype. And it would make it dynamical. And then there would be no separation. Now, I actually think that's the right approach to take. That's quite a big step. So, although I do sort of deal with this here in the book, the archetypal plant, I try to do it in a very, very careful way. In fact, I don't actually, I leave the word in German, and I say why I'm leaving it in German, because I want to avoid using the word archetypal so as to bring in all this halo of meanings. And in fact, it's quite clear from the way I do it that you could then look at the archetype in this Goethean way, where the one is the many. There's no one over many, because the one is the many. And in fact, Goethe had this thing, that's right. He said the universal and the particular, the universal is that level, particular this level, the universal and the particular coincide. The particular is the universal, appearing under different conditions. It fits it perfectly. Anyway, I'll just, tomorrow morning, I think I'll pack up now, finish off that last bit. I don't know. Maybe I've said enough. Well, I can do this now. Finish it now. If I can put this up here. Do I need this? Have I done this? Do I need this? No, I don't need that. The key thing is, oh yeah, no, I do need that. Thanks so much. Okay, I'll just do it. Thanks. That's it. Ontological dualism. We got the higher level and the lower level. This is the ontos on in Greek, being as it is in itself. An immutable realm of existence, persisting in strictest self-identity. That's the higher level. Down here, we have multifarious appearances involved in perpetual change. Now, that's looking at it ontologically. We're now looking at it epistemologically, which is in green. The higher level, knowledge of this is the true knowledge, free from all relativity with regard to subjects and their standpoints, perpetually true under all circumstances for everyone. If you know the higher world, whoever you are, whatever your circumstances, you'll all know exactly the same thing. That's the truth. And this is the idea, this is where the idea of objective truth first came from. At the lower level, knowledge is not true knowledge. Only true knowledge here. Knowledge subject to relativity with regard to subjects, their standpoints and changing circumstances. So down here you've got relativism, and that's built into it. Now the important thing is, this here, being as it is in itself, is an immutable realm, persisting in strictest self-identity. There is no movement, there is no change there at all. All movement, all difference is removed from being. So being is differenceless, changeless, movementless. Wherever there's movement, wherever there's change, wherever there's difference, that refers to the lower ontological level of the mere, what become mere appearances. That's where we are. So what this ontology has done is it has taken all movement, all difference out of being. And you have a movementless being, and down here you have what amounts to beingless movement. This is all kind of mere appearance. Now what the work we're doing is why my book's called The Dynamics of Being, is it's putting the dynamics back into being. It's saying, no, there is movement in being. There is difference in being, and that is where the difference originates, in being itself. But it can't be the kind of difference and movement you've got down here. That's why it can't be one thing and another thing and another thing. It's always got to be the same, but differently. And that's why it takes this intensive form. So what the work which this is here, really, is very radical and very heretical. Because it's going against 2,500 years of Western philosophy and saying, look, there is movement in being, there is difference in being. It's dynamic. Being is dynamic, not static, not an immutable realm persisting in stricter self-identity. And so that's really what this comes to. But this, you see, this is what Goethe does, I'm saying, but also it's what modern philosophy does. Since 1800, this has been the direction in which European philosophy has gone. And you find this in Spain, in Heidegger and so on. But people don't really pick up on this. They don't realise the tremendous transformation that's taken place. It's still not actually talked about as much as it should be. But this is the point I want to reach, because this is the real root, core of what all this work is about. It's as it were, putting the dynamics back into being, which I think is pretty fundamental. Okay? So that's I think that's as much as I want to say. Probably as much as I want to say anyway. I think I can go home now. You will have questions. And you may want to ask questions tomorrow, and I'll briefly indicate another example of this, but only briefly. I'm just going to sketch it, not going to go into detail. But if you want you to... can you follow this last thing I've done? It's rather important.
I don't.
You don't.
I know that you're getting dynamics into being, which is changing the top view.
Yeah.
I don't get the rest of it and where it fits into the whole picture.
Well, the rest of it
and where it fits into the whole picture of what we've been doing.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Well, I tell you what, instead of bothering about that, just remember what we've been doing. I'm serious, because you may not be familiar with this. If you're not familiar with this will be a great surprise. But this, I mean, I always wonder whether to talk about this, but this is actually what has been very fundamental to the whole historical development of the Western way of thinking. And so, but today, it's like so many things, we don't know about it. It's actually infused our thinking to such an extent that it's actually, we think in this way without realising it. And it's a bit like water and fish in a way. But if it's never been brought out explicitly, then it may be very confusing. Now, you don't need to bother about this. What really matters is what I've actually been doing, which is actually doing this dynamics. Are you happy with that?
Yep.
You can forget this, so I'll switch it off.
No.
Okay. I mean, the fact that it comes to that in the end doesn't matter. What matters is doing the thing itself. This is the wider implication, but you can manage without the wider implication. It's all like the foundations of physics. You know, there's always stuff about the problems in the foundations of physics. The physicists don't take any notice of that, they just continue doing physics. And someone said that, well, if they change the foundations of physics, what difference will it make? Because we'll just keep on doing physics. And there's all these people going on writing books about the new understanding of the foundations of physics. Physicists couldn't care less. Well, you know, if they changed the whole of physics, the whole foundations of physics, someone noticed it wouldn't make any difference to the physics. It would continue just the same. And yet people get very excited about that. Well, it's rather like that. What we've been doing is what counts. This is the kind of ultimate historical foundation. But so what? It doesn't matter. What matters is what we've been doing. I mean that too. I'm not saying that. I mean that. So those of you who are not familiar with this background, because I know that many people aren't now, and why shouldn't we? Because many people come from a different kind of background to what I come from, and some of them don't. So why should you? And it doesn't matter. What matters is what we've done. Just get that dynamical thinking, and that's it. How about a dynamical cup of tea? Can I switch off now?
No.
Is there not a chronic contradiction if I just look at the green text? In that someone's saying knowledge is not true knowledge down here, but then sorry to put it in these terms, but some arrogant academic has decided that there is this true knowledge outside of their own thinking. But how can they when their own knowledge is not true knowledge?
Well, there you go. You're right. I mean,
Is that there's a contradiction.
the whole thing's riddled with contradictions.
Yeah.
But it's had an enormous influence. It comes down historically. You see, the influence of Plato and Aristotle is enormous. And I wonder if tomorrow morning I should just say something about how that happened. Because, well, not really. It had such an impact when this stuff was discovered. It talk about blowing the mind. You see, when the Arabs got hold of this stuff, they were knocked sideways by it. And then it gradually filtered through into Northern Europe in different phases. An earlier phase through Spain and through Sicily, the Arab countries. And then a later phase when Byzantium was really on its knees with the Ottoman Empire knocking on the door of what was then Constantinople. It all came through from Constantinople, the Platonic stuff, came through into Italy and so on and that. And whenever this has happened, the power of this Greek stuff was so enormous. Nobody in Europe had ever seen anything like this stuff. And if you go back in history in the Middle Ages when Aristotle turned up, people were absolutely bowled over by this. You couldn't imagine there was anything like this. It's very, 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 very powerful. And really, the Western historical development was hugely influenced by the impact of this Greek material. And people thought, more or less up until now, that whatever the Greeks did was it. They used to think you could never improve on that. And that had to be the model for everything. And it's really only in the 20th century that this idea has dropped away. And most people don't even know about this now and couldn't care less. But it's only in the 20th century it's really subsided. And we're actually entering into a new world. One of our problems is we have to get beyond this kind of stuff now. One part of getting beyond it is to see the influence that it's had on us. So it's very easy to underestimate the power of this, and you have to study history. And if you do, you realise then the power of this and the mind-blowing influence it had on anyone who came in contact with it, because the people who came in contact with it had never encountered anything like that before in their lives. So it's really had this, but all you can do today is sort of stammer on like I do and say, well, yeah, it's really very important. But It doesn't seem that way to us today, because we're entering into a different world, in which this has been transcended and gone beyond and needs to be left behind. But you know what's it say? You can get the man out of the Stone Age, but you can't get the Stone Age out of man. Well, that's what we've got here. You can get the man or out of the Greeks, but you can't get the Greeks out of the man, because it's actually infiltrated so deeply you don't even know when it's operating, and that's this dualism. And what's exciting, of course, is what happened in the last 200 years, particularly the last 100 years in philosophy, is very different to this and is shown an entirely different picture. But that will take a long time to filter through. Historically, these cultures, these things don't happen overnight. They can take hundreds of years. I mean, in 500 years' time, perhaps even earlier, the stuff we're dealing with here will be what everybody thinks. Wouldn't imagine otherwise. Let's say, for example, I mean, it may not be that, but there's something else. But the kind of stuff we're dealing with now, in 100 years perhaps, things move faster now, don't they? In 100 years perhaps, 200 years, it will be just taken for granted what we now see as being terribly new. This will be how people think. You can understand that, perhaps. And that's why, you know, this is how it happens. In the medieval period, there would be a small group of people working in a room somewhere, introducing this extraordinary work of Aristotle and Plato, doing things with it, and no sense at all of what was going to happen to that, and the revolution that was going to cause, and so on and that, and go down through history. Yes?
Well, it seems to be that there's so much bashing of Descartes or Plato or reasoning, and yet it seems to be that it's a natural developmental step that we needed to go through. And so, and that now we're moving into a different place, and many years from now we'll look back and go, look how limited they were, my gosh, you know. But it seems, instead of going and looking at it and seeing, oh my gosh, we got off track, we've got to get back on track, it seems that there was a natural progression that we needed to go through to be able to develop what we have done.
Well, I don't say we got off track and we need to get back on track. I don't know what track we were on. But I don't know. I don't know.
Track is,
yeah, but I don't know whether what you say is true or not. It might be true. I just don't know. Whether is it? See, I don't have that degree of understanding to be able to say, well, we have to go through this. Now, I know some people do say this, but I don't know whether that's true or not. Some people do say what you've just said. Other people say, well, it's actually more contingent. This happened. And it could have happened differently. Because certain things happen differently in other parts of the world. I mean, so you can't go to some other parts of the world and say, well, you're never going to get anywhere because you haven't gone through this. So we'd better come and tell you about Plato and Aristotle and the Greeks, and you can go through that now. Well, so you can't. See, I can't get a feeling myself that this is necessary. But I can get the feeling that it seems necessary to us. That I can understand.
We can look back and see.
Yes.
Yes.
I can see that we would do that.
Yes.
But I can't see that it actually really is because of other people who don't go through this. So. And of course, this also gets carried. See, with the Western thing, all the Western stuff getting communicated all around the world and having such an influence, this stuff actually gets carried with it without being realised. A lot of stuff has been now written on the attitudes towards it, all sorts of things. And we've said enough. I've had enough. I want to get a tea. I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
And then.
You can go home.
I go home.